All right, Daniel, welcome back. It's been a
It
while.
is oh, it's been far too long. It's a complete delight to see you, Ethan. I always enjoy these conversations immensely, and thank you for being you. So thank you for the chance. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm happy as well. Super stoked for this one. I think we have a lot of food for thought, a lot of topics of conversation to dive into since our last call. Um, and so I wanted to just lay out a couple themes here, and then we can kind of see which ones feel most alive. Um, so a couple themes that have been top of mind that I think we could have some really beautiful conversations on. Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, kind of rationality and the importance of rationality, and then subsequently the limits of rationality, and is the true the rational, so on and so forth. And then also belonging again. I'm trying to recall. Yeah, I think it found your book found me a couple months ago or about a month ago, and I was grappling with different worldviews, Ayn Rand's kind of objectivism, grappling with kind of like Buddhist like non-rationality as the kind of pinnacle, and then other worldviews, and sometimes that brings up a sense of deep confusion and deep existential anxiety, as you put it. Um, and I've been going through this process of kind of leaving this place that I've lived in for 3 years and finding what the next place is, and traveling and living solo for the last 3 months, just in the wilderness. Not really wilderness, but as far outside of civilization as you can go. Um, and it's been really eye-opening to see your work on, is this like a universal thing? Are we all struggling with belonging? How does pluralistic societies create new problems that we've never seen before? Last night I was diving into belonging again, and you talk about the meaning crisis versus the map, or what was it?
Right.
The map crisis or the confidence crisis and the institutional decay crisis. And these are some new angles that I'd never heard. I've heard like, there's like AI risk, there's like all these different risks, but then you talk about institutional decay and confidence and the male, you know, all you could say all sorts of different crises. But the way you framed it was a little bit different than I've heard with from John Vervaeke and some of these in Schmachtenberger, which I kind of liked, kind of how you were diverging, or the semantics there was a little bit more precise. Um, and so I guess where we could kick it off is, let's start with Ayn Rand. I think that's the most logical starting place. I would love to hear first, like, why is this text so beautiful? You called it a cathedral at one point. And when you tell me a little bit about your experience reading it historically, and what kind of like what it filled for you and what problems it solved for you, and then kind of the moment that you realized that maybe it had its own limits.
No, excellent questions. All of that is fantastic, and I always appreciate the chance to speak with you. Atlas Shrugged, I read a lot of it when I was in China teaching English because I could take one really large book and not have to stuff my suitcase with a bunch of things. And so I took it with me. And read through it, and I was very, very impressed with how just everything freaking fit together. Like it just all led into one another. I also appreciated how the plot tried to incorporate philosophy and real stakes, and in a manner though that did not feel like it was poured in from the top, as my dear William Wilson would say, that it sacrificed plot and story for those different things. I found that very engaging. It was also full of things like there's one part where the characters are saying something like, "Oh, y'all think laws are for y'all to follow them. No, law exists because we want you to break it so we have something over your head that we can use against you at any point." There's the money speech of Francisco, which I think is very, very well said. There is this idea too, something I very much appreciate about Atlas Shrugged is the way that, say, in an Orwell or many more books about kind of totalitarianism or things like that, Atlas Shrugged has more where the totalitarianism is slow and subtle. And it's not that you have these people who have some sort of giant conspiracy to take over the world. It's where one thing leads into the next, whereas you slowly try to control pricing and resources, that leads to this, that leads to this. And it's really no one, there's more in that book of a way in which people are to blame, but then it's also nobody it's to blame. It's like a metaphysical zeitgeist, if you will, of how to approach reality that leads to a certain outcome. And I think Ayn Rand's emphasis on this kind of almost spiritual warfare, she would not like that language, but this kind of spirit that actually leads to the collapse of a civilization is correct. I don't think it, I think you end up in, or if you end up in something like Big Brother, it's way after that spirit. It's much later on that that shows up. Um, there are movies like Brazil that in a comedic way play off this. I'm also a lover of Kafka. Kafka also has an idea where we end up imprisoned, not because there's any sort of top-down effort to control us, but because our consciousness directs us in a certain way. Now, of course, Ayn Rand is all about top-down control and people from on top. But those efforts are often from a place to bring down costs, to, stop greed, stop all of these different things, right? But the consequence of that is ending up somewhere where you don't know how you ended up here. I think also I very much like in Ayn Rand the emphasis on the things you usually aren't paying attention to. The blacksmith, the guy who works the trains. I grew up in Virginia. I've always been around people doing manual labor, people that are doing infrastructures, trucks. And something I always was very familiar with is how remarkable it is just to have food at a grocery store. Like you really don't realize the entire infrastructure that makes that possible. Like if you're able to go to Food Lion and get a jar of Nutella, because that's what I sometimes bribe my children with, then that's basically a miracle. Like it's a miracle that you can do that. Like, because it goes to that economic idea of nobody knows how to make a pencil, right? So first, someone has to invent Nutella. With second means that there's access to the knowledge of how to do it. Third, the ingredients of Nutella. Fourth, you have to figure out, and that's a miracle right there that anyone can even invent Nutella because it's probably made of ingredients. I don't know the exact ingredients. And someone will tell me, well, those ingredients are killing your kids. Okay, well, they like it, guys. We have to balance these things. But there's this idea that these ingredients come from many different places all around the world that you somehow have to bring together. But let's say you invent Nutella. Well, how am I, Daniel Garner, going to get it from some guy somewhere? Well, you have to package it. You have to make a package. And it has to last. Then you need trucks, which means you need roads, which means you need restaurants where the truck drivers can eat at, which means you have to have people willing to drive. I could go on. Like the infrastructure, the supply chain that makes the world work is a freaking miracle. Like it's just a miracle. And honestly, I think now, mainly after COVID, because of all the supply chain disruption, people became more aware, a little bit at least, of that. But back in 2009, no one talked about supply chains. No one talked about these things. But I grew up in a world where you're constantly surrounded by running manufacturing, and so you're really aware how big of a deal this is. Mm-hmm. And you're also really aware of how intellectuals very often were not aware of it, and in fact took it for granted and had ideas of how everyone in these places were doing it wrong, and how there was a kind of, in a weird way, I directly experienced how the quote unquote smarter people got, that the more invisible the supply chain became to them. Like the higher up the ladder they climbed in the society and were successful, the more, in a weird way, oblivious they became. And I had experienced it. I had seen that. I knew that, I knew that was true. I'm not saying I knew it was true in every case, but definitely you experienced that. And Ayn Rand was the only one I had ever read that was fully aware of that. Like that is absolutely at the core of Atlas Shrugged. And for me, the breakdown of society, starting with a interruption of the supply chain, manufacturing and all of those things, seemed realistic to me. Like it seemed like that's how it's going to happen because of that invisibility of the supply chain by the people in power, of that sort of ignorance there. It seemed just very, very believable that that is in fact how the society would begin to destroy itself from the inside out. Her emphasis on societies falling because of the inside out also seemed correct to me. Um, and that, so it was just very tenable, the stories he was saying. Also, she's obviously escaping from the Soviet Union. She's escaping. She's an immigrant, right? And she's talking about how her father had this experience where basically the government seizes it, takes it over, her school's bombed. Like she's also had direct experience of this occurring. And basically she's making the claim that when societies fall apart, it is in this kind of, basically it starts with disruption of the stuff that makes your society work, like the trucks, the road, the manufacturing. Like that's what makes your society function, actually. Not just that, but that's why you're able to go to the grocery store. Dang it. And for her to make the argument that it's the disruption of that begins the chain reaction of the breakdown of a civilization, perhaps from my own bias, but seemed correct. Like I could believe that. I could see that occurring. And she was making a claim that that is indeed what historically occurs when societies dissolve from the inside out. So that was very compelling. There's way more to be said, but I'm going to pause with that if you have anything to say so far.
No, that's beautiful. That all tracks and resonates. I've always had this. I've always pushed back a little bit against this idea of like this invisible people pulling invisible strings at the top. I've always assumed it would be systemic in some way. Um, yeah, it makes me think of I think we also discussed. I've been reading Conflicts of Vision by Thomas Sowell, Constrained versus Unconstrained Visions. And as I'm reading it, maybe it's because I just finished Atlas Shrugged, but I'm like, oh, the constrained vision makes so much sense. And I never have thought about it this way. And I've been raised in this world that's kind of indoctrinated me into this unconstrained vision that the more intelligent, meritocratic that you are, the more you can control a society and do what's good for society writ large. And just to kind of bring that idea in here, it's feeling increasingly absurd to me to think that a few intellectual people could architect the infrastructure for an entire society, for the economic, the legal, the moral, like all of these different things. And maybe we can loop that in because it's really fascinating to me, the like wisdom of the common person. And it's just like that idea that there's like rational logical intelligence, and then there's like the lived experience of the millions of people on a day-to-day basis, whether or not they have a high IQ, and how important it is to how important those people are. Because I think it is really easy to say, oh, there's all these problems in the world, let's like, I don't know, climate change is a thing. Okay, let's develop a top-down system to try to solve it. And it's like, is that really ever going to work? But I'll just throw that in there. But I'm curious to hear some more of the points that resonated with you or didn't resonate with you in Atlas Shrugged. I found, yeah, the money speech was really amazing. I really like that money speech from the economic side of thing. I was like, okay, now I'm seeing kind of Hayek and Austrian economics in a new light. But I'll pitch it back to you here.
No, I think that's wonderful. I do think Conflict of Visions is Soul's best book. I think it is a significant contribution to the field of epistemology because it suggests that basically people's decision making is going to be based on some sort of, well, axiom. Ultimately, it's going to be based on something that you can't prove or disprove that you choose to believe about reality. That doesn't mean it's false, but it means it's a necessary presumption that makes possible thought that's going to then determine what's rational to do. If you believe in the constrained vision, what's rational to do is very different than if you believe in the unconstrained vision, right? And that's where the true isn't the rational. What you believe is true, the constrained vision, because there's absolutely overlap from what Soul's talking about and what I'm talking about with the true isn't the rational. Like if you think it's true, that if you think the unconstrained vision is true, then what is rational is very different than if you think the constrained vision is true. Now, of course, arguments can be made that if you're overly on the side of a constrained vision, then you're not going to take any risks. You're not going to try anything new. And if you start getting a society that enters a sort of Keynesian stagnation, you're going to be stuck into it. And this is where it all gets complex and fun. But the conversation, like I'm leaping ahead a little bit and I'll withdraw. We need to take seriously the debates and conversations that Hayek had with Keynes. I don't think we've actually appreciated those discussions. There are some videos online of the rap battles or whatever. Those way simplify the arguments that they were having. Hayek even said that when Keynes died, he wrote a letter and said it was the greatest man I ever knew. What? I thought you guys hated each other. Well, they disagreed, but they didn't hate each other. And actually, Keynes agreed with Hayek a whole lot more than people often realize. But the issue, and I'll have to get into this, is that Keynes felt you couldn't cleanly divide politics and economics. That by the time that sure in the long run the economy will recover, but he says, but we're all dead. What does he mean by that? It's not always clear. What he's saying is by then World War III has started. By then World War II has started because the population has risen up in the Great Depression and gone in the direction of popularism. Keynes is writing before World War II, seeing how paying back the debts in Germany, like the kind of how Austrian economics unintentionally can create the conditions of a popularist revolution, which you could just say, the Austrian could say, well, it shouldn't. Yes, but Keynes is like, as a politician, he's like, but it does. And then what do you do once you have a tyrant rise to power, right? Hayek did not blow that argument up. Like Hayek is aware of this problem, in my opinion. Now it becomes a much more interesting debate. I'm going to shelve it and to get back to your fantastic questions, but I guess what I want to say is I don't think we have adequately thought that debate, that conversation and relationship between those two. And as a result, we don't even know what we need to discuss. Now, with the supply, it's very important too to note the more top-down tyrannical parts in Ayn Rand occur after supply chain disruptions that then the state is running in to make up for. That's really important because it's the suggestion that the true totalitarianism is a reaction to the unintended consequences of the interventionism. So it starts with intervention, with good intention, and maybe even like good intention of real problems, like the tragic vision. These are real problems, right? So you intervene to make it better, but then you get unintended consequences. And since the unintended consequences of disrupting the supply chain are very difficult to fix, the way I think about it is like Wittgenstein once said about a spider. He said, trying to fix a culture is like trying to repair a spider web with your bare hands. I love this line because the supply chain is like that. Like once you break it, trying to fix it is like trying to repair a spider web with your bare hands. It's very difficult. Complexity science will talk about the difference, and the great Dave Snowden will talk about this, between complicated and complex. And a complicated thing is something that you can take apart and put back together, like an engine. So it's complicated. I can take an engine apart and put it back together. Complex is something that once you take it apart, you can't put it back together. Like the human body. If you take my body apart, you can't actually put it back together. I'm dead. Like I'm dead for good. Right? Therefore, it's complex. Much of the economy is complex, not just complicated, then actually you can't put it back together. So what ends up happening is the supply chain is a lot more complex than it is complicated, meaning that if you take it apart, you can't put it back together. Now, this gets into the argument of Keynes, though, as well, where he's saying that if you have a Great Depression and all these businesses go out, it's complex, not complicated. They won't come back so easily. So the kind of boom and bust cycle that the Austrian believes is going to clean out the economy is not so clean because you have a complex system. Oh, but to stop it, don't you need the interventionism that unintentionally causes unintended consequences that lead to the tyranny? Yes, this is starting to get at the real problem. Is that on the way down, there's a risk of breaking something complex, but then the effort to stop the bust itself can have complex unintended consequences. That's starting to get at the serious econ debate I think we need to have. Now, again, I keep pointing ahead. Forgive me for that. But what's talking about with the constrained vision and why it overlaps with Hayek and what Ayn Rand is showing is basically the reason why you cannot top down an economy is one, because it's complex, meaning that if you screw up, you don't get to recover. And top down, by definition, because it doesn't have all the local knowledge that it needs to make good decisions, will inevitably, just by probability theory, make mistakes. And since you're dealing with a complexity, it won't be able to do those mistakes again. Therefore, there's a natural entropy, if you will. There's a natural sort of dissolve. But to explain that a little better, the way I always sum up what Hayek is talking about with the knowledge problem. And there's two different major critiques of interventionism in Austrian thought. You have the coordination problem of von Mises, and you have the knowledge problem of Hayek. Now, they strongly overlap. What Mises is talking about is different. It's not quite the same. It's probably more going to get into, I almost want to say, cybernetics with Luhmann, although Hayek is very inspired by cybernetics and stuff like that. But the way I would sum up at least the Hayekian knowledge problem, which I know Thomas Sowell likes very much, is no matter how smart I don't know how many, I could be Albert Einstein, and unless I work at the local McDonald's, it's just not going to matter, because there are just simply some things that no matter how smart you are, you can't know unless you're there, right? So I could be Albert Einstein, and I won't know how many plastic spoons the McDonald's at Ward's Road needs to order unless I work there, right? Like local knowledge problem. Like that's the problem of local knowledge, right? And what Hayek argues is that 99.9% of the knowledge in a society is local knowledge, not abstract knowledge, right? It's knowledge that can only be known by participation in, right? And his argument would be that the supply chain is a coordination of countless amounts of local knowledge managements between people in local knowledge situations that can only be known by the participants, that the sum total of their activity gives you the economy. Now, the argument then can be made that this is the kind of argument that then Austrians might suggest, is that collective knowledge, and this critically, that collective knowledge is a collection of local knowledge more than abstract knowledge, okay? So this the bumblebee stuff, so the hive mind, all that stuff. So it's collective knowledge. Now, there can be an argument that the collective knowledge gives you the most rational outcome, like the best outcome versus interventionism. It can be more helpful to say it's simply the only option. Like, rather it works or not, by your standard of what is working, it is unimaginable to have any other way to manage well, whatever well is, as well as possible. There's no other way to manage well a system that the high majority of what it's managing is local knowledge than to have a free market by which lots of individuals, each with their own little piece of the puzzle and information, interact through a market to give you the sum total, right? And yeah, we know that gives you inventions. We know that gives you air conditioning. We know that gives you technology, Dietrich McCloskey, grade and risk. We know that this tends to be the environment in which intervention, like innovation and inventions and all of these things emerge. Is every one of those inventions the best? Or do some of them create addictions to cell phones or whatever? Of course. No one is saying that everything this system creates is quote unquote good. That's not really, in my opinion, what Hayek was even trying to say. He was saying there's simply no other option unless you don't want air conditioning, unless you don't want, and problematically, this is also what I think Hayek would say. And if you go on and say, well, I don't want air conditioning, I don't want to participate in the capital market, I don't want to be part of all of this, well, the day will come where you face a tragedy, someone dies from heat stroke, or you don't have food, and then without the supply chain, you're going to petition to the king to provide it, and now you're going to tap into power to get access to those things, right? And that's basically inevitable. So seeing that that will inevitably occur, the question is simply what is going to provide the air conditioning, or what is going to provide the solutions to your problems? If not the market, you can say all day long that you don't want a market to provide your solutions. But when you actually experience the problems, you're going to turn to the king. You're going to turn to power. And inevitably, that's inviting tyranny. And it's not even effective because the king doesn't live in your local knowledge environment. So however he solves the problem you want him to solve is probably not going to do a very good job. And you're going to get unintended consequences and so on and so forth, right? So Hayek has a very powerful critique of the local knowledge problem. He extends this to basically saying that's how law is formed. That's how tradition is formed. That's why you need to have history, because tradition is a collection of various solutions and addresses to local knowledge problems. It's providing mental models that are going to help you through local knowledge problems. He wants to argue law is organic and emergent in this way. And he's really sort of pushing collective intelligence, if you grant that phrase, collective intelligence. The constrained vision is basically saying whatever the collective conscious, if you let me say this for short, by collective consciousness, I'm thinking market, supply chain, and all of that. The constrained vision is basically saying, which he also, I believe, calls the tragic vision. Like we, and he has that book on cosmic justice and things like that. The collective consciousness is the best we can do. And it will make mistakes, and it's not perfect. But every time you see a mistake, there's then a temptation to try to intervene on the collective consciousness to keep that mistake from happening. The tragic vision says, don't do that. You can't avoid all the mistakes. And in fact, if you try, you will get unintended consequences that cause distortions in the market that make things worse because it's a complex system. Ayn Rand is basically suggesting that tyranny, not only do you get inefficiency and unintended consequences if you make this mistake of intervening in the market, that's how tyranny enters the scene. That's how it enters the picture. And you could argue it's actually a terrible thing. It's like, it's really messed up in the sense of the politician, and I'll pause after this and throw it back to you, and then there's more to say, but I'll throw it to you. The politician can make the choice to intervene on the market, okay? That then causes an unintended consequence that the politician then has a justification to jump in and fix, which then increases their power, because then that makes the market fail, which makes it seem like the politician should have been involved, so they get more involved. Then the market fails more and more, which makes it seem like the market isn't good, so the politician should be more involved, and it grows and grows. So there's a really problematic dynamic here, meaning the politician can benefit from screwing up the market, which makes them seem right. And thus there's an incentive for the politician to screw up the market because they benefit from it. That's something that I think Ayn Rand is trying to show. And it's really kind of, is it like, let's take this example. And I'm not even saying that this interpretation is correct, but let's say it is. All right. So Freddie and Fannie, through subprime mortgages and all of that, create a distortion in the housing market that arguably contributes strongly to the 2008 financial crisis. Now, there's a lot more factors, but let's say that occurs. Well, Fannie and Freddie is a government, it's the government is buying up mortgages basically through Fannie, et cetera, so forth, right? This causes housing prices to spike, right? And to go up because houses become more valuable, and it's supposedly supposed to bring it down, but there's all these distortions that happen, and the market goes up, and because basically people are making housing going up without actually being able to pay for it because you remove the balloon payment, you don't have to put a like 10% down payment, all this different stuff. So basically, prices go up, which then creates, you could say, an affordability crisis, of which you turn to the government to fix. But the whole reason you have that is because of the Fannie and Freddie stuff. Okay? But then it all blows up in 2008. And this is then taken as evidence that capitalism doesn't work, that the free market is a failure, right? When actually you could argue that this whole occurs because it's not a free market, it's a mixed market, right? And you could argue it's also because the Fed keeps interest rates, too low for too long and all of that different stuff. Well, at that point, they're high, but then they bring it low. The point is, you can interpret all of that as evidence that you need the government involved, when arguably their involvement caused that problem. So they get more involved, which causes more distortions and price distortions in the market where assets are high and the younger people can't. You could argue younger people, this would be a crude simplification, but there is a strong argument to be made that when the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates down for 10 years, that's going to hurt the younger generation. It's going to be because it's going to boom the market. But if prices are high, young people can't buy it, so they're upset. So who do they turn to fix it? The government, to bring down asset prices, right? So the point I'm saying is that if you accept the interpretation, and then you could also argue that corporations are not free market. Many corporations are in bed with the government. They're mixed market phenomenon. They're not free market phenomenon. You could have an interpretation where a very large amount of market distortions and problems are due to government intervention, which the government is then called on to fix, that makes them bigger and more powerful. So they have every incentive to get involved, because even if they screw up, they get stronger, right? And you could then actually argue that they want to screw up because they get stronger, right? And they don't get held responsible for it, right? Now, that is all a very simple story I'm telling, but that is something that Ayn Rand is pointing to. That is something that many of the Austrians are pointing to, that once you start with interventionism, it creates a feedback loop where the state benefits even if they fail, and thus there's every incentive to get involved. So basically then the argument of, well, you could say even federalists, is that you must make sure there's a system that the state, which I'm using as a general term, that can mean many things for many people, but the government, the state, you must never allow them to get involved at all, because once they do, the incentives are created to actually distort the market more and more, so they get more involved and they get more and more power and they become the savior and so on and so forth. That, for me, with Atlas Shrugged, because I definitely see Atlas Shrugged as kind of pointing toward this vision of how totalitarianism works. That absolutely seemed plausible to me, because I also saw, working with small businesses, having I ran a photography business for many, many years, just being involved with working class people, I absolutely saw how the person who ran a business was the bad guy, even though they were getting up at 5 a.m. and working like a dog. If they owned a business, they were seen as the bad guy. How if they got audited or the government showed up, that the government was the savior, they were the bad person. And then as the business leaders did something to make the government happy, and it actually had unintended consequences, they then actually had to go to the government to change the thing, and the government then was in the role of the savior of the problem that was actually caused. And then critically, this is where Ayn Rand is completely correct. You know what those business leaders eventually do? Leave. They leave. They close shop. Because why? Why deal with it? It's not worth it. Like the other issue occurs is that the other thing I'm just very sympathetic to is, a lot of people say, well, should the owner of the business make so much more than the employees, right? That, et cetera. It depends on what business you're talking about. I will definitely tell you that if you run a business, which means you have to take it home with you, like you're always mentally in that space, it's not going to suffice to make a little bit more than the worker. You're going to need a significant amount more to deal with the headache and to deal with all of these problems? Should it be 500 times more? All of this different stuff. Those are different questions. But if it's not like 5 times more, if not double, it needs to be like in the 5 range, you're not going to do it. Because you'll be, because the other thing too that I'm going off on a different thing, but the other thing that occurs is like, there's a misunderstanding that I think it's just kind of a straw man to say a lot of business owners are greedy and they want to make a lot of money. A lot of them believe in it. They feel an obligation to their workers. It's like what they do. There's other things. They don't know what else to do with their time. It's like why rich people work until they're 80. Why do they do that? Because you could argue they're afraid of not working. So there's all these psychoanalytical things you could get into. But you see, it becomes very simplistic when you start saying it's about money. And the reason why that's important is because there are many people that say, fine, I won't run a business. I'll just go work for someone else because it's not about the money ultimately for them anyway. It's a part of it. Money makes people feel respected. It makes them feel like you take seriously what they're doing. And all of this I need to elaborate on. But the main thing that Ayn Rand is pointing at is that there is a certain point where the people who make your businesses are going to leave, or if they stay, it's because of guilt. They feel guilty. They feel obligated to keep doing it. She's 100% correct on that. I've seen that all the time. And I'm not saying every circumstance, and I'm not saying there is no, but notice also there are many business people in Atlas Shrugged who she's not a fan of at all. She sees as bad people. So it's not business versus state. It's a certain spirit she's trying to draw attention to. There's a certain spirit that is different. It's not simply business versus state or whatever, because there's actually many business people who are in it more for the money, who are in it more for the status and control. And she's not a big fan of those people, right? But she also doesn't want us to say money is evil, because he's like, do you know what happens if you don't have money? You have guns and force, right? So he's pointing out all of that in the famous Francisco speech, right? But the idea that what ends up happening is if you are not careful, then the people who make your supply chain and complex society work, they will just leave because they don't have to do it. And if they don't, you're going to have to guilt them or use ethics. And that's why she's also critiquing many forms of ethics that are actually guilt-based. Jockin and I would say that much of our ethics are based on like do's and don'ts and guilt versus beauty. Like her ethics starts going in the direction of something that's more based on the beautiful and friendship and gults and all of that different stuff. Now, to what degree she succeeds at that's where we get into other matters. But again, like all of those things that are present in Atlas Shrugged, I just think they're correct. I've experienced them. She's right about this more than if you're going to end up in a Big Brother, I think she's correct that it's going to have to be on the other side of something like Atlas Shrugged. Like it's on the other side of something like Atlas Shrugged. The same, and if you end up in a Huxley, it's because the world is falling apart because of stuff in Atlas Shrugged that then you're trying to hide people from. Right? The technology is going to be used to make up for the unintended consequences that occur via interventionism and good intention and so on and so forth, right? I'll pause there. We can move into critiques. We can move into like the A is A stuff that was big for me or anything you want to talk about. And I hope that answers your question on bringing Soul and Rand and Hike together, because that, in all honesty, the local knowledge problem that Hike is talking about, it perhaps is not taken with enough seriousness as it should. And I almost want to say no one should make any move on the board of politics, sociology, economics, or whatever without accepting that as a rule of any move you make on the board. Like any move you make on the board per se cannot overlook the local knowledge problem. It must always keep the local knowledge problem in mind. If you make a move on the board not aware of that problem, you're going to mess up the complex system, and we're in huge trouble. But I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's amazing. Appreciate it. Yeah, where do we want to go with this? First I'll share that, yeah, being a business owner now for the first time within the last like 2 years. I started business almost 2 years ago, and yeah, the sympathy for some of these challenges I can relate with so much more, and it's really fascinating to see how I kind of got I I have a sense that with, and we can even go into this, Ayn Rand, I don't know, I think you said you've read like nearly all of her books. There's one that I read, it was a bunch of her magazine articles, Return of the Primitive, and
Mm,
she talks about like education as this like subtle indoctrination to focus on conformity over individuality, and how we're kind of like our rationality is like slow, like the same way it's not like all at once, it's like it slowly withers away out of us because we focus on the guilt of being a part of a group as a part of, as opposed to individuality. But I will say like my experience is that with school it was like very much like deep conformity with the group, and the unconstrained vision was kind of what was taught. Like I'd never had exposure to this idea of a constrained vision, or of, and even if like I it wasn't called those exact things, like even the core axiom of like, it was like, oh yeah, like government just like solves problems and figures out like like what it needs to solve, and then it intervenes, and that's just how the world works. So it's really fascinating, and yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the kind of price gap of a business owner versus a worker, and it's just like, yeah, like maybe that's not such a bad thing. Like maybe there's unintended consequences of trying to intervene and create policies that make the tax rate higher for business owners or whatever that looks like. um because it is really challenging to run a business, and it's really challenging to hold the weight of the complexity of what needs to happen on any given day. And maybe this goes into some psychoanalytic stuff, but like then you're dealing with the like, and I don't know if you see any overlap between this and like the kind of existential anxiety and pluralism, but I know for me, phenomenologically, those experiences of like not knowing what worldview to have and waking up in the morning and not knowing what to work on in my business feel very similar, you know. Like I got a fucking a million things to do. I got a million things to do. I have no clue how to prioritize them and who I should reach out to and what I should do, because I am the one that has to choose, and there's no perfect answer, and I'm the one that has to figure out what to do, and I'm never going to feel fully confident in that. And then how do I build up enough motivation to do it? Feels very similar to there's 100 worldviews I could have right now, and I don't really know which one to choose, and I'm the one that has to choose them. And so maybe it's like, maybe there's some overlap there, and maybe there's some like, yeah, the business owner should make 5 to 20 times as much because they have to hold that psychological weight, which a worker does not. It's a lot psychologically simpler to just be like, okay, here's the objective, go do it. Um, and that's what I personally struggle with, is like, okay, how do I adequately make choices in a world where there, I think you talk about this in Belonging Again, there is like really no how you, I think you frame it in the context of where to live, who to associate with. Like if you choose to live in one location, like you'll never know if it was the right location. You'll never know if all the other locations you could have lived, what lives you could have lived in those different places. You can you can never know for certain. And so how do you hold that psychological that weight, that existential anxiety? I think it's a core question. Um, but yeah, I appreciate your kind of reading reading of your analysis of Ayn Rand, because some of the things you said, I haven't really thought about them in that way before. Um, yeah, I think I would love to go into. I mean, the economics part of it is fascinating, and I don't want to diverge too much from some of these really fascinating things. I guess, all right, I have two things that I'll pitch back to you. One is I had a really blaring question as you were talking about the housing crisis of like, do you have any thoughts on like what's happening in the world in the last 4 years that relate to some of these ideas? That's probably a massive question. But even just like last 6 months, or it seems to me like maybe I'll just share kind of what my thoughts are on it. And after reading your work, is like I think we could approach that question from many different angles, but I think one angle is like, is there like are people more appealed to kind of totalitarian narratives because of the complexity and breakdown of pluralism, but also like how do you frame the current situation with it seems like the limits of some of the unconstrained visions are becoming increasingly clear to an increasing amount of people. And so maybe that's causing some of the disruption. Um, but and then a completely side question, which I'll just toss in there. You can answer them however in whatever order you like or whatever way you like. Um, yeah, so to go to the kind of like the true is not the rational, I it seems like that idea is so much more appealing to me after reading Ayn Rand because I see that and then I like instantly, not for that long, but for a couple weeks, I'm like, okay, rationality all the way. Rationality is going to solve all of our problems and everyone needs to be more rational. And I was like, wait a minute, like I'm a very rational person at times and it's got me into a lot of trouble. It's got me into a lot of self-deception. And so how do you, it seems like rationality is like the core piece of the puzzle where, if you don't have it, you're going to fall into a lot of problems. And also it's not enough in and of itself. And for context, I don't fully understand what you mean by the A is A thing. I don't fully understand that. But I'll pitch that back to you in terms of like how is this playing out right now in the present day and how do we grapple with the core challenge of rationality alone leads to self-deception.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot. That's fantastic. And one will note, and this is kind of so we don't find out how people become John Galt. We don't find out how people become Francisco or Dagny or whatever. And this is a major problem. They just kind of exist out of nowhere. Um, I the kind of sobering view of Atlas Shrugged is that everything she says is basically correct. There's just no John Galtz. There's no people like Dagny. That there's all the bad people, all the kind of bad quote unquote people, what she calls the looters, the moot, these kind of people. Oh yeah, that's all very real, and that's it. That's it, and that's kind of the reality. And you see, so the way she basically deals with this view is a deep belief in this individual, this Overman, this she loves Nietzsche, this notion of this sort of heroic individual. Now, I strongly, strongly sympathize with the notion of this kind of heroic individual as playing some sort of very important role. But the heroic individuals are more like characters out of novels like Alyosha or Benji or other literary characters that are a mess, yet they try to do the right thing. A Tale of Two Cities, people are drunkards and then they ultimately turn out to doing some sort of sacrifice for others, but stuff like that. Like, often human beings are a mixture. They have Galtish characteristics, they have Galtish potential, but they end up giving in to the temptation of Radican after listening to his brother Ivan Karamazov, Alyosha does, right? And also, too, the psychoanalysis comes into the picture and sort of suggests that the Galt characters are not so simple. Furthermore, there is often this kind of idea as well that you one of the things that's very interesting in her book as well, though, is she tries to sort of overlay people like Galt or the banker, whose name I forget, with it really is important that there's that scene where the banker, right before he vanishes, he says, "Do you know how much I love life? How much I love life." Like, these characters in Galt's are not just that there's a love of life that they're defending. that defending money is defending a love of life, right? That they think that actually it's not about dominance and control, that life is supposed to be grand. Life is supposed to have this sort of rising out of the muck and making this train, rising out of the muck and making something beautiful. And she's very critical of basically this romanticism of pre-industrial age, this romanticism of before we made societies. He's like, you really don't understand how much life sucked in the past, how difficult it was. And people like Dietrich McCloskey stress that as well. And so there's this real defense of a love of life that is kind of going through her work, right? The problem also, though, becomes and this is where one starts kind of looking in the direction of Marx and sociology and different things, is we are habituated by our environments to have an understanding of what love is, that our love of life is always in jeopardy of being habituated out of ourselves. It's not we have to actively defend. And it is also unlikely that in our environments don't actually tempt us in various ways to lose sight of that, to engage in a certain self-forgetfulness. Ayn Rand, there was a part, and what I'm getting at is there was an editor of Atlas Shrugged at some point that changed the dialogue of Dagny in one scene to where she sounded unsure, where she said maybe. And Rand got mad. She's like, no. Dagny always says yes or no. She never says maybe, and she's never unsure. That begins to suggest a problem, is because humans are unsure, even the heroes, even the saints, even the beautiful. That's in fact what makes them heroic, is they face the uncertainty and they learn to handle with it. Her characters never internally experience the loss of givens. They're the given. They are the given. Like, they are the standard, and they have entered a state where their decisions are like steel. They're like her characters, their inner life is industrial and solid, like the material they work with. Like they are the same thing in a certain way, right? This is not human. Humans are never given. And if they are, they're closed-minded, and you achieve that in the banality of evil that leads to Nazism that Hannah Arendt is warning about. When you have that, when you feel as if your decisions are solid, that means you have reduced complexity. That means you have found an environment to keep out otherness. You are not in the real world going to have characters that always say yes and they're never uncertain of themselves unless they have simplified the world out of its otherness and reality, and they are basically ignoring something. And that is one of the major mistakes of Atlas Shrugged. There are no John Galts. There are no Dagnys who are certain of everything they do. And if there is a person, think about the people. Let me put it this way: think about the people in your life who are never wrong. Are those the people you want to be around? Are those the people that you would describe as loving life, as finding everything romantic, and they have these conversations that go on for hours, and they're able to give a Galt speech at the end that goes on for 8 hours? I don't know about you, but in my experience, it's the exact opposite. The people who are certain of themselves are the ones that don't love life, that don't have this playfulness of life. Like I hope I'm making it, she links together this inner state of absolute certainty, this kind of inner state, with the love of life, with this sort of excitement and this sort of like deep friendship that everyone has in Galt's. I don't think that's the case. I think it's like basically the exact opposite. Like, actually, the people who are able to hold uncertainty and be confident in the uncertainty. What Ayn Rand is getting at is kind of true, in the sense as you've got to be able to like hold yourself high. You have to be able not to get overwhelmed. But you don't get there by not feeling uncertainty. You get there by getting used to handling uncertainty and being confident in it. That is not what Ayn Rand is suggesting with Dagny. They are suggesting that they know what is the case, right? Which makes sense because her metaphysics is very strongly based on a hard A is A logic. Now, that opens a big thing that we have to get into. But I'm kind of focusing on a certain critique that I think is a major problem in the work. In my experience, the people who are always certain are some of the most difficult to relate with, the most difficult to talk with. And actually, they often can be the ones who do the worst businesses or have the worst or who actually don't create the best products. The people who I find are able to make to make the spaces you want to be in because you have fantastic conversations with them are actually not too sure of themselves. They have a certain openness to possibility and they're questioning themselves and maybe they're more Socratic, of course, right? There's a whole lot of emphasis on Aristotle and Rand, not so much on Socrates that I recall. That also is important. And also her Aristotle is the Aristotle of the logic. It is not the Aristotle of the metaphysics as I recall. When Aristotle himself would not accept that separation. For him, it all goes together. And the logic for him is also a pragmatic guide. It is not to replace the metaphysics. Now, I've said a whole lot there that would have to be justified. But Rand also, look, Rand is also, I think she would shoot back at me something like this. If I were to guess, she'd be like, okay, Dan, but guess what? If people aren't certain, if they don't have this deep interior self that is able to be self-guiding, then interventionism's coming. Government's going to come, make them doubt themselves and get in there. Right? Like if people have this internal state that isn't held together, then we're done because manipulation is coming. The system is going to fall apart, right? Because people are going to come in there and it's going to manipulate them, right? She might be right, but that doesn't mean John Galt exists. Like that doesn't mean John Galt exists, right? Even if she's right about that. At the same time, she also is trying to show something that is true in the Galt character, which is that there's a few individuals who just seem to invent everything. Nicole Telsa, he doesn't just invent one thing, he invents like 7 things. You have Leibniz, who's an expert on China and philosophy, these polymaths. Like there is something true to the idea that people who strive to be fully alive, they almost become a different species. Like there's this kind of idea that she's pointing to, which is kind of Nietzschean, that these people who kind of rise to the occasion, they're Promethean, they're quote unquote gods with a lowercase g, right? Like they just take off and they become these extraordinary individuals, right? And a society that overemphasizes the collective can deny that reality of that potential. Now, I think Ayn Rand would want to say she wants a world where the amount of Galt's spreads, that people actually are able to tap into that excellence, right? I don't think she would say she doesn't want to spread that. She wants to defend that because she also wants to point out that if the society loses those individuals, we end up in a lot of trouble. Right, we end up in a lot of issues, and I think she's correct about that. At the same time, it's not correct to associate those kind of people with an inner life that does not have doubt, that is always certain. And I think then, I'll stop. Although there's all the other things you said, because I haven't even gotten to today, with like what we're seeing today. But I'd be curious how you would respond to what I'm saying, if it's fair, if it's unfair, or different things. For me, the case study I would make that also, when I found out about, kind of opened up why there's a deep incompleteness in Atlas Shrugged, even though so much of what it says is incredibly accurate in regard to how societies fall apart, is there's a biography on Ayn Rand that basically goes into her personal life by someone who was a deep friend of her. And basically, Ayn Rand ends up in major sexual scandals with students, younger people. She kind of like leaves her husband, and it's a long story, and it's very sad. It's so sad. But this is what was very interesting about it. So Ayn Rand basically at one point, just very matter of fact, is like, I feel love for the student, therefore I have to love them. I have to sleep with them. I have to have sex. It's no guilt, no guilt at all. There's this notion of I feel love toward the student, therefore sleep with them. And she didn't even thought it was, she did not at all think it was immoral. She didn't think it was adultery. She told her husband, she didn't even hide it. It wasn't even like, it wasn't even something secret because she's like, it just is. A is A. I now have love for the student, therefore I sleep with them. No doubt whatsoever. No doubt whatsoever. And you see, that's where you begin to see where what the certainty of John Galt, the no doubt in the inner life, because it destroyed like her friend. Because if I recall correctly, it's Barbara something, I believe. It's like her fiance or something who writes this, and she's like best friends with Ayn Rand.
Mhm.
And like, don't quote me on that. Those details may not be correct. But basically, Ayn Rand is sleeping with younger students because she thinks she doesn't really believe in. I don't believe she doesn't see sleeping with multiple people as necessarily unethical, like polyamory or things like that. I don't. She's not like saying poly. She believes in polyamory without using that terminology, right? And she may resist me saying that, but there's nothing inherently wrong with, say, sleeping with another person while you're married to someone. Okay, that for her is not inherently unethical, right? But of course, it devastates her husband. And there's a scene in the biography where I think it's Barbara is going down the elevator with the husband, and the husband is just like, "What is going on? Like, can you make sense of any of this?" Right? Like, just totally devastated. But so Ayn Rand devastates her husband and best friend, and she's like, "What's your problem, guys? This is just reality. And if you're devastated, that's on you. There's something wrong with your inner life." Because if I simply feel the absolute of loving this person, I have to sleep with them, it's just metal on metal. It's just building a building. It's just engineering. There's nothing to be upset about, right? So if you guys are upset, there's something wrong with you. So then, of course, they're not allowed to say that they're upset. And they all have to accept this affair that's not even an affair because it's just this movement of the absolute. Right? This is why the sex scenes in Ayn Rand have this kind of strange character to them, right? Like, I think a lot of people overdo it when they say they're rape scenes. That's a little much. But there is this kind of forcefulness, this kind of, we just have to do this now, right? Like the characters in Ayn Rand, Dagny is sleeping with, she's sleeping, like moving between a lot of these different people. And there's no immorality, right? Raiden or Reagan, at the end, he's totally cool with John Galt, right? There's no anger. That's how she felt like everyone should be in her personal life. Like if she's just sleeping with someone else, that shouldn't bother because it's just the movement of it's just A is A, right? I want to have sex with this person, A is A, right? That begins to and that's all psychoanalysis. That's all desire. That's all drive. That begins to unravel the picture, right? And so, but then here's the problem. You poke on this. If you start going, wait a minute, Dan. So you're telling me Ayn Rand is right on how the government, basically accurate. I don't know if right, accurate on how societies dissolve from the inside out, local knowledge problems, all of this stuff. But there are no John Galts. Doesn't that mean we're screwed? It does sound that way. But that's the reality. I'll pause.
I like that. I like that conclusion there. Oh, that's great. Yeah, a lot of thoughts going through my head. That's really fascinating to hear about the personal life stuff. I've never heard that component of it. And something that I'm still grappling with Rand is is a couple things. One, there was a resonance in me when I see like she kind of equates love with like the value system of two human beings meshing well. And
Mm-hmm.
like if you have like a looter with a John Galt, like there's no
Sure.
chance that love could ever form because I think it's Reardon and his wife
Mm-hmm.
is like the two value systems don't clash, and how she makes that almost like a political thing where she frames it as he wants to love life and fundamentally her core motive is to destroy that love of life is kind of how she frames it. I don't know exactly, but that brings me to questions of the guilt, like the kind of the I think you said like the ethics of guilt being how right and wrong is imposed on a civilization? And does that mesh with personal relationships as well? Do you get into personal relationships where one person's metaphysics or philosophy and another person's philosophy, one person is kind of trying to kill something in the other person that they are trying to cultivate? That's a really interesting idea to me. And it's really interesting, this whole the whole guilt aspect in and of itself is very interesting to me. It's something I've definitely experienced, and it feels very, very present in the world writ large with okay, yeah, business owners should feel guilty for making more money than the employees, or Ayn Rand even talks about it in the context of environmentalism. Like um we should feel guilty for building industrial societies that kills nature. And she's like, no, we shouldn't. Like, you want to try to live in the like in the forest with no technology, good luck. Like, I'm not going to feel guilty for destroying nature in the process. And it's an interesting idea, not in the sense of like, okay, let's go destroy nature because yay technology, but in the context of there's some impulse in say the environmentalist or the unconstrained kind of axiom that says no, like this does, like, you should feel guilty, and we need to like pull this spark out of this aliveness out of you, because otherwise, you know, how do I frame it? um I wrote a piece on this recently on environmentalism, basically just summarizing her work, but it was about, oh yeah, a lot of environmentalism is feeling guilty for being human, essentially, because that's how she frames it, is that if you if you're human, you're going to impact the environment in some way, shape, or form. And the core her understanding of the environmental worldview, especially in the 60s, she's responding to stuff that's happening in the 60s and the Vietnam War and all this stuff with the environment, is like, okay, because you are human, you should feel guilty. That you
Yeah.
were in kind of even like original sin, she brings in that idea, but
Mhm.
um, and she says that's utterly wrong. And so I guess what I wanted to bring in here is, okay, going back to what you said, there are no John Galts. There certainty is absolutely, it's very hard to have absolute certainty, and if you do, you're pretty intolerable to be around. Um, at that point, is there merit to the guilt? Like, is there something in, like, obviously the guilt is so widespread. Why is the guilt so widespread in society? Why is it so attractive? Why does it make so, like, why does it feel so right and make so much sense for so many people? That, because if it didn't make sense, if it didn't feel right somehow, we wouldn't have half the population or more that are completely enraptured with the guilt. And so in a sense, it's like, how is there a steel man for that as well? Is there a steel man for like, okay, I don't like, it makes perfect sense to me. Like, yeah, the more I feel the guilt, it feels like she kind of calls it like this death impulse. It kind of feels like a death impulse, a death drive. And then it is that like a whole other can of worms, like a Nietzschean or something, of like the death drive versus the call to life. That's, I think that the because I when I read Ayn Rand, I was like, yes, like I've always had this kind of core inkling in my philosophy of like, that which makes me love life more deeply and love existence more deeply is good. And so when she kind of elaborates on that, it makes perfect sense to me. But maybe the question is, how do you actually get to that place where you love life? And maybe is the way that she's describing actually the best way? Maybe that is a good end goal, but maybe the way you get there is entirely not how she thinks that you will get there. Maybe it is like you sit with uncertainty deeply enough, and then you learn to love the pluralistic world, and you can love anyone no matter what worldview they have. Could you say that Ayn Rand creates kind of an us versus them in a way that isn't possible in a pluralistic world? But that's just a bunch of thoughts on it all. And there are people who do make the case that polyamory is a good thing. And so it's like that gets into a whole other conversation of
Hmm.
traditionalism and are the traditional family structures needed to keep a society together. And I
Hmm.
believe that I haven't developed the rational argumentation and logic why, but I have a gut sense that yeah, traditional kind of family structure is probably really important. And if you I lived in a very left leaning place, and I saw people's like multiple mothers and multiple children, multiple families, children, and multiple moms and multiple dads all living under the same household. And I'm like, how in the world would this ever work? This seems like madness and destructive to the children's psyche to not know who's the dad and who's the mom and all this stuff. But yeah, I'll stop there. Pick up whatever.
No, I mean, all of that is fantastic. I mean, so a few things before I forget. First off, like there's an argument to be made on the question of like how much should business owners make or different things. It is very important in Ayn Rand that money is gold. She's not very happy with moving off the gold standard. And there is an argument to be said that in a world where, and all of this has to be expanded on, like today, quote unquote, see, inequality may not. So there's two ditches where you say inequality necessarily equals injustice. That's wrong. But then there's another issue where assuming inequality is a result of a process that necessarily is non-zero sum. Non-zero summing meaning it raises everyone up. Because the ultimate argue of capitalism, of free markets, is that free markets are non-zero sum, meaning there are winners and losers, but even the losers win. Like even the losers are better off than they would be without the winners, right? So there are winners and losers, but the losers are better off for being in this particular system of winners and losers because overall in capitalism, all ships rise together. Like it's non-zero sum. Zero sum means that one person wins, the other person loses, right? And that in sum it's zero because it balances out. Non-zero sum means it goes that way, right? Now it could go the other way, of course, but the idea is that it would go, together. To the degree that is the case, may have a lot to do with if you have a fiat system after Bretton Woods versus gold. It probably is affected big time if companies can buy back their own stock, if CEOs are given stock packages, if you have the ability to weaken the spending power of the currency to make asset prices go up, and most businesses are heavy in assets, and then only they can afford the assets, and you get all of these massive inefficiencies. So we also have to suggest that even though I think it's absolutely the case that you must pay the business owner significantly for them to deal with all the existential challenges of, of what they have to deal with, it does not follow that today all inequality, quote unquote, between business owner and workers is a efficient outcome or reflects what is necessary because it actually may reflect what occurs when you have a monetary system that isn't based on gold or something like that, right? That may be what Ayn Rand shoots back. Also, the counter argument, I think, would be to say, um, the likelihood that bosses' pay is reflective of a, dare I'll say, rational process assumes the ability of workers and people in the society to move and flow around easily. So there's an idea in Austrian economics that if a business is not creating value, that they go out of business, right? That people won't buy their product, that it'll go out, right? Well, if there's a certification regime that makes it really hard for me to start a restaurant at my house or a catering business because I have to get certain licensing and regulation, then I can't leave my job. Or I have to continue to buy from the restaurants on offer because it's not easy to start a new thing. And if there are certain regulations, that means you have to have 3 sinks. These are real regulations, if I'm not mistaken. You have to have 3 sinks, rinse, wash, and like another one. Well, then who can afford a house with 3 sinks, dang it? Like very few people. So the ability to, this is my point, the likelihood that the competition in the system generates a optimal outcome is contingent upon the ease of movement in the system. And if it is very difficult for people to get new jobs, then their bosses could be tyrants and they stay there all the same. Their bosses could make a lot of money and actually they don't add any value. And two, it would not follow that the businesses that do exist are necessarily a reflection of the best of all possible businesses that could exist, because a lot of them don't exist because people don't have the regulation, who actually have better ideas for restaurants and better plans for how to do things, but they're not able to get their business started because they didn't go to a 4-year university, and so on and so forth. So Austrian economics needs a lot of ease of mobility in the system. It is not by chance that Austrian economics ends up in libertarianism, because you need radical ease of flow, or the competition will not be reflective of, it will probably not actually reflect the best of all possible outcomes. Like, you need to remove as many obstacles as possible. So we should not assume that in our current mixed market system with money that is not sound money. Now, of course, we have to argue if the gold standard actually worked. That gets into Cole, Planier, and all of those debates. But the situation, at least that many Austrians or people more in that direction would point out, is that the system needs to have a lot of flow. Let me just call it like, it needs to have a lot of fluency. And the money has to be relatively sound. Like, it has to be a stable currency. If you do not have those two variables, then you easily could have CEOs making way more money than they should and it not reflecting any sort of rational outcome, right? And that's kind of also the problem we have when if we want to bring Ayn Rand to bear on our current moment. Well, Ayn Rand's right about a whole lot within the conditions he's talking about, but what if that's not the condition today? We don't have a gold standard. We don't have an ease of flow of occupation, right? And yet, nevertheless, what she's pointing out about quote unquote inequality not necessarily being bad could nevertheless still be true in the way that she's describing it. And our reality is a mixture of all of these conditions together, right? That's why it becomes very difficult. Like, the ultimate, like the strongest criticism of libertarianism, people like Cornel West has said it, other people have said it, is there's never been a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. It has never, ever, ever existed. And the libertarian would simply shoot back and say, well, it needs to exist. Well, it never has. And the way Carl Planier puts it is, ultimately it can't, because of international trade agreements. You have to have a government to write the international trade agreements, and you need to have a navy to enforce it, and you need to have them create the currency. And once you have a government that's engaged in international trade, like international law and things like that, you're not going to have a free market. You're going to start moving in the direction of a mixed market. Now, Carl Planier gets into a lot more. There's another reason why you don't get a free market. You always get a mixed market, and that's because people have to be convinced to engage in capital markets. They don't necessarily do it naturally. Like, von Mises wants to argue that rational people will become capitalists. Like, if you are rational, you will become a capitalist. That is not the case, because the true isn't the rational, and people can disagree on what is a rational use of time. Because if I enter into capital markets, then I also have to accept an expert class, and I might just enjoy building my own house and not getting the expert to build my house. I may enjoy barter and trade. I may not want to have to get money. I might just want to trade skills, right? Now, you could argue, well, barter is inefficient. Well, people don't necessarily agree. So what are you going to do with those people, right? Nevertheless, it shows that capitalism does not necessarily follow from a rational calculus. Should it? Well, that's the problem. Who decides? You get into many things. That argument really has to be expanded on. But without doing that, I'll get to the guilt stuff, because this is really important. What Ayn Rand is saying about guilt is really, really important, Guilt is absolutely used to control people. She is what she is saying about love needing to take metaphysics into account or people's worldviews is super important. That's really good advice. You should definitely take the person you're friends with or love. What is their philosophy? And if you don't take that into account, you're going to get some issues. And basically, she's also suggesting that one of the main ways people hold relationships together because they don't take philosophy into account, perhaps because they can't articulate it or whatever, is guilt, because inevitably something happens, clash, or you don't want to be around those people anymore or whatever. So the only thing that holds it together is guilt, a sense of debt. So he's pointing out that most of society is held together by debt because it doesn't know how to be held together by values, because it can't articulate values and it doesn't have values. And basically the suggestion is if you're not held together by values, you have to be held together by something else. And basically the easiest one is guilt. Because the reason why it's guilt is because the only other option is force. And she's trying to describe how you get to force. Like, you don't go straight to force. You don't go from values to force. You go from values slowly to force. So how do you get the slowly to force? You go through guilt. She's suggesting that guilt becomes the dominant ethic, but that's on the way to the barrel of a gun, right? Because guilt is kind of a way to hold together. It's kind of like the barrel of a gun, but it's not the barrel of a gun, right? Like, I'm threatening you. I'm saying that there's something, you must do this. Guilt is kind of like a soft power. I'm saying you must do something. A gun is saying you must do something, but guilt is trying to convince you to do something because you're guilty, right? So there's a power dynamic in guilt, right? And a way to look at Ayn Rand is she's against all power dynamics in relationship. Like, there are no power dynamics in relationship. It's all simply yes, no, yes, no. I value this, I don't. I value this, I don't, right? Now, critically, that means there's not much room for covenant or vow or anything because there's no value in this. Like, there's a real way in which the role of the promise in Ayn Rand is like a Derridian promise is not very clear because there really isn't promise. There's either the presence of value or not. And if it's not there, then I'm under no obligation to stay because the value is gone, right? And if the value is here, I don't need a vow because I want to be here because there's value. So promises and vows and covenants and stuff like that, they don't really have a role. That's also why you can get into sleeping with someone in your marriage and it not be immoral because it's there's no obligation. There's simply value. And adding more value, adding another relationship, quote unquote, does not take away from the value that came before unless those other people do something wrong, unless they resist it. Well, if they resist it, that's their problem, not mine, quote unquote, right? So you get that sort of issue. Also, it may sound very odd. This is where you get the kind of the weird move. There's basically, as I understand it, there's no power dynamics in relationships. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't worse and better. Like, there's clearly a picking order in Galt's, but it's not a power dynamic because everyone can see that Galt's the best. It's just isness. This is the interesting idea that there's a picking order, but not a power hierarchy in the sense of I have to use power to manipulate you. There's a suggestion in Ayn Rand that valuable people just see value and kind of get it. They just kind of get the picking order because they see it. So you don't have to manipulate anyone. Everyone will, in a kind of natural way, fall in line. Like, that's like why Reardon has no problem with Dagny going with Galt because he just sees that Galt's better. So he's okay. He's fine. He's not upset. There's no manipulation. He just goes with it. That happens throughout the entire book, is that the value people see the value, they see the picking order, and therefore they fall in line without any manipulation, without any hierarchy or anything. Basically, there's a kind of order that emerges in Rand that is like that, a kind of organic acknowledgement of value, who makes the most value, and people fall in line. And a valuable person is precisely the one who can identify the value hierarchy, the value order, if you will. The rest of the world operates by power dynamics versus, let me put it this way. She says in Galt's, she suggests that value people operate by, I want to say, value acknowledgement, a kind of acknowledgement of value, and you order yourself according to that acknowledgement. The rest of the world operates according to power dynamics, meaning there are dynamics we put in order, we get people to do what we want them to do, and the number one tool people do to do that is guilt. Guilt is the number one dynamic people use to create relationships and to hold them together and to order the society, is according to guilt. And who says who's guilty? That's why the state is so powerful, because they can say you're guilty, you're immoral. And because you're immoral, I now have a right to put power over you or to regulate you. You did something immoral, now I can regulate you. So she sees guilt as a means of justification for power intervention, right? She wants to get away with all of that. She wants to remove all of that. No more of that, right? Okay. What she just described there, I'm on board. I completely agree. Relationships based on guilt or debt don't work. Societies based on guilt and debt don't work. And when people use guilt on one another to control them, it sucks. And if you've been in relationships where people use guilt and debt, it sucks. Everything she's saying about that is 100%, in my opinion, correct. However, what about the whole, so here's the issue. She felt no guilt to sleep with her younger student and wreck her husband's life and to wreck right? If she did kind of actions, like had Ayn Rand in that situation where she felt, no guilt for what she was doing to Barbara or her husband, like couldn't have guilt in some sense been a good thing because she wouldn't have caused all this pain to the people around her? Absolutely. So what's the difference between there seemingly is a kind of guilt that's good, and then there's another guilt that's not good? What's the difference between these two, right? Okay. So there's a guilt that is used in social dynamics that is more like nudging, to use that Carr's sustain idea, where I'm trying to nudge you to an outcome, right? So we can kind of overlap, and I've been talking with Jockin and Econ about nudge theory, and a lot of people talk about that now as a kind of a way that government that's going on, where people are trying to nudge one another to an outcome, right? That's bad. Guilt as nudging is not good. Don't do it. If you're using guilt as nudging, or if you're in relationships where guilt is used as a way to nudge behavior, to control behavior, not good. That's not sustainable. So if you see guilt controlling behavior, bad, not good. But then there's a certain guilt that's more like remorse, or a certain sort of I'm hurting someone I care about, and I'm doing it. Not they're telling me I'm doing it, like I'm able to identify that this is not right and that it's hurting them, right? That seems different. Now, this has to be unpacked because I think I know what Ayn Rand would say to me. It's like, well, it shouldn't. Therefore, if I'm bothered by them hurt, I'm dishonoring the truth because they shouldn't be upset, because the truth is I do feel love for this person. Therefore, I'm going to overcome that feeling of remorse. I think that's how she would reply. But you see the problem, this is where we start getting more into the metaphysics, which is that the concept, all of that necessitates a certain isolation of the individual, where the person is not made in relationship, they're made alone. And relationships are how we choose to acknowledge individuals who self-made themselves independent of relationality, right? That's why there's a mystery of how people become who they become in Ayn Rand. Like, how did John Galt become John Galt? We don't know. How did the looters become the looters? We don't know. Because Ayn Rand is very, in my opinion, unable to give a satisfactory explanation of how people become themselves, right? Because if you do that, then you have to get into, well, all of us are made in relationships. All of us are made in families. We are always already socialized, right? Well, if we're always already socialized, then the suggestion that my feeling of remorse is actually a betrayal of the truth. Well, no, the truth is actually made in the interrelationality. So if the moment I say something like, they should get over it, then I'm isolating myself from what they are experiencing. I don't see a feedback loop, and I am making what I'm feeling their problem. And that's where you isolate the development of the individual from the development with the other. Now, all of that has to be expanded on. But one of the things that Ayn Rand, like anyone who, though, wants to say, the individual is made in a social setting, any Ayn Rand comes back and says, you be careful with that, because people use that to justify guilt and manipulation, right? Yeah, but then Peter Berger and all of them shoot back and say, but it's true. I don't invent the word cat. I don't make the stores I grow up walking by. I am already socialized. My identity is already situated in relation with other people, right? So if I disregard those other people, I actually disregard part of what made me me, right? Furthermore, um, there is something to be said about contract. The other thing I would just simply say is that one of the reasons why economics need contracts is because things change through time, the resources don't arrive on it. So you have to have contracts, right? Or you don't have, you're not able to know what's going to happen in the future enough to plan your businesses or stuff like that. Well, if you need contracts, then simply value ordering is not enough. Like, businesses have never been able to successfully build themselves if you just assume everyone involved in the building of the business will see the valuable thing and order themselves appropriately. You need contracts, you need things that people agree on and say they will or will not do, right? That's how you build something long term, right? A suggestion of things like marriage and relationships is that a similar sort of covenant is needed in relationships. That means there are some things you do and some things you don't do, even if you internally feel a need to go outside that contract, right? So we simply do not see it as the case that value ordering is enough for long-term sustainability. And basically, another thing is, we all know that in another way is because humans, even valuable humans, even saints, deal with uncertainty, right? They internally deal with uncertainty, and beauty in life comes with wrestling through that uncertainty. But Ayn Rand does not make room for Dagny to have uncertainty. So there's no need for contract, but that's a repression of the reality. And also, if Ayn Rand herself never felt any internal uncertainty, and thus she thus concluded it was believable to make Dagny and Galt not deal with internal uncertainty, then that would have been a repression that other people paid the price, like her husband and her dear friend Barbara, right? If you make yourself into someone who doesn't have any internal doubt, other people pay the price. And that's what you see in your own life. When you deal with people who never question themselves, it hurts the family, it hurts the business, it hurts things. Someone else pays the price. But since other people were paying the price, arguably for Ayn Rand's unwillingness to be uncertain, she never experienced it. So she was right. She was right about people never being internally uncertain, because she never paid the price for it. Other people paid for it. Therefore, she never experienced the evidence that she was wrong. And that's why we always say hell is locked from the inside. Like, hell is where you're right. Hell is just where you're right, actually. That's why you lock yourself inside of it. And there's a tragedy, and that, unfortunately, by not having a robust understanding of where Galt comes from, you, even if so much of Atlas Shrugged is correct, you have a mistake there that can set you up for locking yourself inside of a hell, if you will, and destroying the lives of all the people around you. I haven't said anything about polyamory or ASA yet, or anything, but I'm going to pause and throw it back at you. So the guilt stuff is important.
Mm-hmm. No, that's huge. I love the distinction between like remorseful guilt and guilt for power, for as a tool for power. And Yeah, I was really fascinated with the kind of libertarian why that cannot work idea, or it's like it's really good on paper. It seems like most ideologies are really good on paper. Um, but not in reality. But yeah, the specifically the point around, or let me go in a different direction actually. When you were talking about like, okay, everyone just sees the value of everyone else implicitly because it is the truth. As soon as you stated that explicitly, I was like, oh, that won't work. Like I just had a feeling in me like that's pretty absurd to think that everyone, and then maybe this gets into pluralism and the givens, like everyone has a different set of givens, or and so how it feels completely absurd to assume that everyone's going to see the value in the same thing, and oh, this person's more valuable. How, if you view it through different worldviews, it might be switched, and you're never going to have coherence along an entire population of which what to value and why and what's more valuable than something else. So that's really interesting. Maybe that goes into why free market is not fully rational, because different worldviews are going to see different things as
Yes.
rational. Um, and and then to bring in another point as well, yeah, this idea that like, okay, we should have free market, bottom up coordinate society. I grapple with this like component of power where it feels like, yeah, how could you ever fully escape from power in a way? Like power, it seems real. Like I would love a world where bottom up everyone is coordinated, and there's incentives and systems that coordinate people. But in a way, it's like, how could you ever escape from power? And is there some, these are just like kind of like open-ended inquiries, but like, psychoanalytic or are there any perspectives that, like, is power just a natural part of being human? Um, I read recently Robert Greene's Laws of Power, and then I wanted to, I just was looking at a couple days ago. I think Franz de Waal, the power ape hierarchy or something. There's this guy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but he basically like goes into apes and how power hierarchies work within apes, and basically says like we're evolutionarily wired for power hierarchies or something like that. I haven't read it yet, but that was what I got from what it's probably about. But it just makes me think like human, like there, it seems like there's a power drive in humans. Like seems like humans have a power drive, or at least some humans really want power, whether it's for status reason, for money, for respect, whatever. But I mean, if you see apes, that there's a hierarchy there. How can you ever get away from hierarchy as human beings between each other, and some people having more power and more control than other people? It seems very highly unlikely to me that you could design a system, or a system could emerge that where that is the case. And I would love to be wrong on that one. But where was I going with that?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, not to jump in, but that's actually really important. What I would first comment on is that Ayn Rand is basically suggesting that free market capitalism is how we can get a value hierarchy instead of a quote unquote power hierarchy. And that's where she has that whole idea that you say that money is the root of all evil, but have you ever asked what is the root of money? It's, a result of exchange. If you don't have that, it's a gun. So it's this kind of idea that for most of civilization, we use power. Now, some people may make a distinction between power and force, like a Foucault or whatever. No need to do that here. But most of human civilization has created its hierarchy via power. And guilt is kind of a leftover of that. And basically, she wants to say that if you get rid of the free market via interventionism, you're going to go back to that. You're going to have a power hierarchy. The dream that she believes free markets make possible is a value hierarchy, which is based on mutual agreement, mutual acknowledgement of what we think is valuable. And the hierarchy, thus, is a product of freedom. You get a freedom hierarchy, not a power based hierarchy that's anti freedom, but a hierarchy that's actually a testament to freedom. right? And honestly, no, you don't get away. I mean, you can go to the great Louis de Monde, Homo erectus, and kind of see how humans are anthropologically hierarchical. We create hierarchies naturally. Can't get rid of hierarchy. Ayn Rand is suggesting that therefore the best we can hope for is a value-based hierarchy, is a hierarchy that we in our freedom value and therefore don't feel oppressed by. That we actually see this hierarchy as a testament to freedom because we all agree to it and we all see that this hierarchy actually generates value, non-zero sumness, and we're good to go. And it also should be noted that there's a very strong argument to be made that quote unquote libertarian free markets is the technically best system for maintaining a value hierarchy instead of a power hierarchy.
Mhm.
That it is kind of, as a system, is the best we've got for the possibility of a value hierarchy instead of a power hierarchy. But here's the problem. And this is where I get into all the stuff on internally consistent systems, the map is, et cetera, so forth. Even if libertarianism is technically perfect, it is practically not. And here's the problem. The truth is the practical, not the technical. This is where we've made a massive mistake. We think the truth is the technical. No, the truth is the practical. The technical is simply the ideological rationalization that makes us keep trying, and it never succeeds. The truth is the practical, not the technical. And you see what ends up happening in libertarianism is because the value hierarchy assumes that people can recognize the value, identify the value, and order themselves according to the value. But they don't. They don't see it. And therefore you get a power hierarchy. So I'll pause there. I interrupted you, but that's kind of the tension here.
I was literally just gonna jump in with that exact question or observation. Maybe let me reframe it a slightly different way. It seems like libertarianism being perhaps technically correct, if everyone were to agree on that, it would work flawlessly. But like same with the constrained and unconstrained visions thing, like you have people that have this unconstrained view of humans and versus this constrained. If every human on the planet just was wired for a constrained vision, and that's just, maybe that would work really well, but humans are not all holding the constrained vision or the libertarian vision. And so how do you work in a world where, and I guess that's what I struggle with, is like, okay, yes, you could say John Galt is the utopia and we need to, yeah, it's but like, yeah, but there are guilt-based power but dynamics. That is a fact of how the world is being run. So what do you do with that fact other than saying, as opposed to saying, we just all need to be more rational and more like John Galt. Uh, so I guess maybe that goes into the givens, but yeah, it's like how,
Well,
yeah, go for it.
for her, the way you deal with it is get all of the people like Dagny to leave, get all the value people to leave, then the society will collapse. And once it collapses, then you go back and now people know better because that's the whole story of John Galt coming and getting people to leave is like the only way to to change people is to make them see where they're going and to get it's a kind of accelerationism. It's like Nick Land before Land. It's absolutely accelerationist what
Can,
Ayn Rand is doing.
can I ask
So it's please.
can I ask you, do you see any validity in the perspective that most systemic change only will happen after collapse?
So there's a few things. Funny enough, I don't think Ayn Rand, I don't recall um if Ayn Rand liked Hegel, but a lot of Hegel's progress is basically that. There's this idea in history that the reason why it's very important, the reason why history is progressive is because, like, the reason history gets better is because we make huge mistakes that cause massive consequences, so we change. So it's not a progress of we make less mistakes. It's a like that there's necessary catastrophe that you're going to come through, and therefore things get better through time. So people will say that Hegel's progress is like we become more rational. Yeah, we become more rational because we screw up like, and learn from our mistakes. So it's not that we got get smarter, it's that we learn from our mistakes. And therefore, for Hegel, history is necessarily progressive. But here's the issue. Hegel wrote before the atom bomb. Hegel wrote before bioweapons. Hegel wrote before World War One. Hegel. So what Ayn Rand is pointing to, um, yeah, by the time uh, they've nuked John's Galt, like Galt planes, the drones have taken it over. Like Galt has been bombed. It's been nuked. The drones are there. Palantir has taken it over. Like it's gone, right? Like those people are dead. Also, Galt is not getting away. Like he's got this invisible thing at the Galts that they hide behind or whatever. Galt ain't making that. He would have to have he would need a government contractor to do it so the government knows about it. So that's gone, right? So the issue is that the possibility of a people separating and coming back, that's not happening. Also, World War III would occur before the return. So it's not to occur. I have a particular view that we are at this sounds odd, a somewhat unique moment. And I talked with C Money about that, which is there is absolutely something to be said that people don't change until a disaster. And there's also something to be said that in your personal life, there are people that have to go through things in order to come around, and that you need to be like not shielding them from that, and that actually you need to encourage people to fail and to go through things to transform, that you should not, in your love of them, keep them from difficulty and even failure. There's a lot of wisdom to that. And there's also something to be said with not trying to save the world. Because I think, because Rand is trying to, how do you have saviors that aren't interventionist, right? Like the whole idea has been that the government is a savior that intervenes. So she can't have Galt intervening. They have to withdraw, right? Or else they would be betraying the very principles they're describing, right? There's something to be said about not trying to be an interventionist savior. That can get you into trouble. And therefore, there's some degree of being okay with bad things happening. I think most of history has basically operated this way. Our real challenge now, between this moment of fourth turning and first turning, is Neil Howe, this catastrophe that could generate a new society or get us all killed, is that it may be the case that the mechanisms that transformed us in the past, if they were allowed to occur, would be apocalyptic, or the devastation would be so vast that it would take 100 years to come back around, right? That being the case, there may be a kind of interventionism that is now needed that saves people, that changes the course of history without it being devastation. But how is that even possible without being top down? How is that even possible without it being an interventionist and without you forcing your values upon other people? And this is belonging again the address. This is the massive, 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 massive question that gets into the 4 hours and a whole lot of things. Happy to go into it. But this is kind of the big, big, big question of the address. The last thing I'll say here and then throw it back to you. The other giant problem with the value hierarchy, this idea that we're saying that is the alternative to the power hierarchy, is we actually don't know what value is, right? Like we don't actually know what it is. And in fact, often the things that we do value, we later on find out we were wrong to value. So you actually need value competition just as much as you need pricing competition. Like I need a diversity of values and people with different values to compete with me. So you need value competition, right? But that assumes that there is a diversity of values and that people are not overwhelmed by that diversity of values. And so this is where Marx comes in and that he's right about. Now, 90% of Marxists follow something called the labor theory of value, where they believe that value and labor are interchangeable, and that's where you get the working class having a right to their labor and rising up and so on and so forth. Now, without going into it, I think that focus on Marx is that's where Marx gets into trouble. That's where like there's a massive problem that happens if you follow the labor theory of value. What I would like to focus on is the beginning of the Capital when he asks the question of exchange value and how does the commodity form come into existence? Like, what is the commodity form? And to cut to the chase, it's a sociological condition. So this is what I mean. When I say to you, this bottle of water is worth $5, what the heck do you mean? $5? What is that? Right? It's a bottle of water. A bottle of water is equal to a bottle of water, right? Like the idea, like if you went to someone in the Amazon and you said this is worth $5, it would make completely no sense. You have to teach people that $5 equals bottle of water. Okay, well, let's say this mouse is worth $5. So bottle of water equals mouse, right? That doesn't make any sense. And yet it's completely intelligible to us in capital markets. We literally come to understand things as exchangeable relative to, well, money and value. So what am I saying? I'm saying this bottle of water is valued at this mouse, that the value of these two things is somehow interchangeable, right? And this is exchange value. A lot more to say, but basically you have to teach people that. They have to be trained to think this way. Like they will not naturally think that a bottle of water is worth $5 or that a bottle of water, if this mouse was worth $1 and I had 5 of them, therefore one bottle of water equals 5 mouses, right? I should have done the reverse, but that's what I just did. So, you know, that's not a natural thought. You have to train people into that, okay? That's exchange value. The argument that Marx puts forth is that with time, people lose the ability to value anything any other way than fungibility. And do we not see that? If you tell someone, I'm going to go learn music, and they say, why? Are you going to be a musician? No, just because I want to. Why would you do that? That's a waste of time. If you say, I'm going to go have a conversation with philosophy for my friend for 2 hours. Why? Are you in a class? Like, what is the money? Are you going to make money? That, you know, the question, are you making money to do it? Basically, you are in a capital society led to believe that unless you're doing something that makes you money, that you can exchange for something, that you're wasting your time, right? So what ends up happening is that a value hierarchy comes to reflect a single value, and that is exchangeability. And so the value hierarchy is not diverse enough to have a value competition by which we could reasonably conclude that the value hierarchy reflects the best of all possible values. Because I would argue beauty is valuable, that self-forgetfulness is valuable, the ability to have a 2-hour conversation is valuable, the ability to love is valuable, the ability to do something because you value it and no one else does is valuable, the ability to do something because you think it matters and not get paid for it, that's value, right? But what happens under capitalism is the ability of people to value things by values other than exchangeability go away. And so the ecosystem of value competition dwindles. And so this would also, and once that occurs, even if you have a value hierarchy, it won't be diverse enough. There will be there's not enough value. There is not enough value competition by which there'd be reason to think the value hierarchy reflects value that is most non-zero sum, that is best, actually. And then the other thing I would argue is that actually wealth creation in capitalism requires value diversity. Like if you want new inventions, if you want people who create new inventions, those kind of people are able to they're able to value things for themselves, right? They're able to do things because they think it's important, even if they're not paid for it. So this comes to my ultimate dismal view of capitalism, because I might have the most dismal view out there, actually. And it's the following that I'm pointing to. Capitalism is the best system by which to organize a society that then trains us out of the ability to create the wealth that capitalism needs to be non-zero sum. And that's where we are. And I actually think that's true. I actually think that's the major problem. Like capitalism's the only thing that overcomes the local knowledge problem. It's the only way, because there's a mistake. Because you could say, you could go. So earlier we said libertarianism is technically perfect, but practically wrong. So people say, well, that's so therefore communism. No, no, no. Communism is also technically perfect and practically doesn't work. It's the same. Like, actually, all of the internally consistent systems are like this. They're technically perfect, but practically they don't work. And the practical is the real, right? So the issue we have is capitalism, free markets, as far as I know, and that's why, and critically, Marx wanted to go through capitalism. He wanted to sublate it. He wasn't anti-capitalism. He thought communism was the natural outcome of capitalism, right? Now, I think the way he thinks about it through the labor theory of values where he screws up, it should be a sublation through the value form. Now, I have to get into that, but basically, there's a major mistake that leads to Stalinism and top-down crap and all that other stuff. But the issue is that capitalism is our best chance at a value hierarchy that in its operation tends to train us out of the ability for adequate value diversity necessary for value competition, which is the condition necessary for wealth creation, without which capitalism stagnates, does not generate enough wealth for non-zero sumness, and then dwindles. And as it dwindles, then the generations get left behind, asset prices go up, the government steps in, and everything gets worse. So this is our challenge, and this is what belonging again ultimately, once you get to book 2, we have to somehow have a capitalism, a free market system that also allows us to maintain value diversity. That's the $1 million challenge. And that's how you get the true and the rational in relation to where we can be rational well, because rationality right now, if it's captured in a single value form, then what's rational is to do that which makes you money, right? Exchangeability. It's not rational to have conversations like this because you're wasting your time, right? Like, what's rational is to go make money, right? That's crude, but you understand what I'm saying. Well, if there's a diversity of values that can compete, the probability of a rationality emerging that actually is best is much higher, but you have to have that competition of values, ergo truths, ergo ways of relating, to get adequate competition between the possible sets of rationality, by which then the market is most likely to create non-zero sumness. We currently don't have that environment. And so we've got an issue, because with the loss of givens, and I'll throw it back to you. But with the loss of givens, the average person is existentially destabilized, right? In a weird way, that means they're actually perhaps more able to handle a diversity of values because they are already destabilized. They're already like, nothing is certain. So actually, the subject that is existentially overwhelmed can actually be more existentially prepared for value diversity and competition if the education system, if the society then created infrastructure in which those existentially destabilized people could enter into and be trained. So that's where there's a hope in the loss of givens. But there's also a massive challenge in the loss of givens, because the natural thing to do in that environment is to go to the dictator, is to try to return to the past and things like that. So that's where today there's a great hope, but also a great challenge. I'll stop there.
That's amazing. Thank you for foreshadowing the belonging the end part too. It makes absolutely perfect sense. To me, I think in belonging in one, you start speaking of free market, and then you switch it out for like free exchange of ideas or something like that, which really resonated with me. And yeah, just this sense of, because yeah, I've experienced that firsthand, the capital being the only hierarchy that makes sense in our current world. It's really hard to get out of it. And when you do get out of it, I haven't seen anyone get out of that effectively, or I've seen a lot of people who are really fed up with the fact that everything is measured in terms of money, and yet their solutions are entirely nonsensical and they don't make sense, and they fall into the same traps of every other thing. And so it's like, oh, therefore I need to go live in a cabin in the woods, or therefore I need to become communist, or therefore I need to, like there's a lot of different like default modes that people fall into, traps that people fall into, on the other side of that. And so, yeah, it is really fascinating to me. And in the then you spoke about intervention potentially being necessary given the current world moment. Um, I guess my curiosity there is there a way to how do you think about it? Is it a better way of designing incentives like as opposed to solutions? Because I think you spoke a little bit about that in belonging again with the importance of process, right? Is there a way where better processes could be designed as opposed to solutions? Because when you think of interventionism, it's like here's the solution, we're gonna do this thing and you must
Right.
comply. Whereas like why does capitalism work so well? Because it is fundamentally a system of incentives and processes as far as I see it. And so it begs a question of therefore the solution likely needs to be better incentives and processes, not better top-down solutions. And maybe that's something that you've thought through belonging into or whatever that looks like. But and then the other question, and you know, like I appreciate these conversations because I feel like I'm just starting to come at these questions, and it seems like you've really chewed on these questions for years and through reading many different thinkers. So like you through these conversations, I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that thinker was, you know, now I gotta go I'm like just starting to put the puzzle together, and it feels like you've been putting this puzzle together for quite a few years. Um, and so I appreciate that a lot. And I guess the question is like, one, is it better processes and incentives? Two, if you do come up with a better process and incentive, how the hell do you switch? How the hell do you make that transition? It's not entirely obvious how you make that transition in a way that doesn't fall into the Ayn Rand top-down guilt,
Mhm.
power hierarchies, trap. And so I'll pitch that back to you. I know we're over 2 hours, it looks like. So we can um I'm available, but I want to respect your time and make sure we find a stopping point that feels good. But I'll pitch that back to you and yeah.
Well, you are a gentleman. Alas, I do have to go down to the venue and do some contracts in a little bit. I do have some more time. We'll have to talk again because this is all extremely important. And I appreciate an individual who has read and respects Ayn Rand, but also we have a major problem today where basically we feel we can't like a thinker unless they're right about everything, and that person doesn't exist. Like, I don't care I don't care if you're the most hardcore Marxist on planet Earth. I think you really should respect Ayn Rand. I mean, Atlas Shrugged is an incredible achievement. Now, as I am pointing to, there are major problems that ultimately come up. But even if you think Ayn Rand is a disaster, even in her quote unquote being a disaster, she helps outline the problem we need to think. And even if that outline is invaluable, because there's like two things you need. This is simplistic, but to take on a problem, you need the articulation and the address. If you don't have the articulation, you can't do the address. And so even people like Ayn Rand, who you may feel are wrong, she's articulating something very real, something that really you need to take seriously. And if you don't have that articulation, you're going to be in trouble. Now, there are many thinkers and books and Marx and that are outlying like the crater of a meteor. You're walking around a crater to figure out what. Imagine you had a big crater and you're trying to figure out what it was and you didn't know about meteors. Walking around it to trace out the hole, the thing missing, is a really necessary step. And there's many of these thinkers who are tracing an outline of something we as a people are missing that we need in order to address our current moment. And so, someone like Rand is really important. And you need that ability to hold respect, but also not get lost in, right? Like another thing is like it's seemingly very difficult for people to study someone like Marx closely and not become a Marxist, or to study Luther closely and to not become like a Lutheran. Like it's very difficult to study something and not get and to not start identifying with it.
Mhm.
But it's really important not to do that. Not because you disagree or agree, but simply as a kind of mental practice to be able to start outlining what we need to outline to address our moment.
Mhm.
What you were asking about the intervention there, yeah. So there's a few principles it would have to follow. There's a few things that the new address would have to follow. First, it can't deny the local knowledge problem. Two, it can't guarantee the outcome, because if it guarantees the outcome, that's top down, which would mean that all it can do is increase the probability that the address could occur, but not guarantee it. Because if you guarantee it, you're now in force, right?
Mhm.
Three, it can't be scalable. It has to be spreadable. Like whatever the address is can't be something that you scale up a power hierarchy, because that would necessarily then require force. But it could be something you spread, which means you increase the probability that the average person in their local particular difference encounters something that increases the probability they change in how they experience the world in a manner that increases the probability that there's greater value diversity that people can handle and think, right? Now, something that spreads more than scales is culture. Culture doesn't really scale, it spreads, right? And culture is very real. And culture is not merely food and clothing and holidays. Culture is very ways of taking on, like experiencing the world, right? Um, Culture spread. And if it was the case that our problem is more on the side of the way that the subject, the person experiences the world than it is policy. Like, so here's the other issue. If our main problem is more of how people experience reality, if you just let me say it that way, then it is policy, like law, then there's hope. Because that's a culture matter, right? That's something that actually can be spread to people without force, right?
Mhm.
For the means by which people are transformed has to be indirect. It can't be direct, because if it's direct, then it's force. It has to be indirect. Well, what's an indirect way to impact people? Environments. I walk into a mall. I can walk the food courts that way. It gives me options. It gives me direction, but not force, right? Because I'm in an architecture, right? Now this starts bordering on nudge theory, and that's why we have to not have a guaranteed outcome, because nudge needs a guaranteed outcome, and it has quantifiable metrics. So also, I guess we're on 6 now. 6, the outcome you're looking for cannot be quantifiable, because if it's quantifiable, then someone has determined how it's quantifiable, someone's collecting the numbers, et cetera, so forth. So the new address has to be qualitative. It has to be a qualitative change by which people experience reality, not a quantitative metric. 7, this is only possible if there is something of which every individual has access to, of whom is socialized, which is 99, there's always the possibility of a wolf boy or whatever, but there has to be something where the socialized person is already doing something that if they did in a different way, then it would change their subjectivity to a different quality. This is why the argument that subjectivity is shaped by language is a very big deal. Because if everyone uses language and how you use language changes you as a subject, then it is theoretically possible for everyone who is already speaking to do that thing they're already doing in a different way to change how they experience reality. Because the giant claim of many people, without going into it, is that literally how you speak impacts how you see. That speaking is not merely the conveying of information, that you literally experience reality differently based on how you talk. Like it's a massive claim, but there seems to be significant evidence that this is the case, that words are not merely vehicles of information, but they train you in your very experience, right? And of course, language is not just bound to words. There's hand gestures, there's facial, like all of that different stuff, right? This also suggests why free speech is a big deal, like Jonathan Rauch and others, because free speech creates different kinds of people, not just in a sense of free speech being about the expression of my personal likes or whatever. Free speech isn't about that. There's a theory that a society with free speech literally creates citizens who experience reality differently than a society without free speech. Free speech is not merely the ability to voice your opinion. It is an ecosystem that creates a different kind of person all the way down. Massive claim. I think it's true. Have to justify it. Think it's true, right? 7, whatever the new address is, can't add anything. Because if it adds something, you violate the local knowledge problem. And how do you add this thing? That would be resources, power, etc., right? It has to be a negation. It has to be a taking away of something that is keeping from, okay? So it has to be a negation. Can't be an addition. Has to be a negation of something possible in all possible circumstances that is keeping people from living their life in a manner that changes their subjectivity, in which, in it not being so changed, they're incapable of handling value diversity, which is necessary for value competition, without which you can't have a value hierarchy that is likely to reflect the best of all possible values. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? So what is keeping people from value diversity must be a negation. Now, funny enough, the loss of givens could be a step toward that, even in its terror, right? That's why the loss of givens should not be conflated with a mistake, even if it's a massive challenge, even if we stumbled into it without realizing it. The loss of givens can actually be a step, because that is a negation. You're not adding givens, you're taking away givens. That's why, because the loss of givens was a negation, it was able to impact everyone, because everyone can have a negation happen to them, not an addition. An addition becomes tyranny and people rebel and whatever. Adding givens, which is what a lot of people are trying to do now, going back to Christian nationalism, that's creating what? Tyranny? So you can't add anything, but you can negate. And negation can be a road to real freedom. Like, funny enough, this would have to be justified. In complexity science, usually emergence is a result of negation, not addition. Like, Michel Planier pointed that chemistry, like when you study chemistry, as I understand it, more complicated chemistry compounds are a result of removing a function, not adding a function, right? So you would think complexity is a result of addition, but it's actually a result of negation, which is very odd. But to have greater complexity without violating like the laws of thermodynamics or whatever, right? Like you have to somehow get negation to generate complexity, right? So, but if negation creates complexity, then it is theoretically possible to get complexity without violating local knowledge problems. Like it is possible to do. And actually we see emergence happens, right? Because the new address is ultimately an emergence. You have to emerge to like emergence is not coordination. You can't coordinate to a new society, but you can emerge to a new society, right? So how do we increase the conditions of possibility? How do we change the conditions of possibility in a manner that increases the probability of an emergency without guaranteeing it, and do so through a negation that then allows people in that negation to increase the probability that they can handle value diversity, thus engage in value competition, thus give rise to a value hierarchy that is of an increased likelihood to reflect actual value and freedom, right? That has to be what occurs, right? Okay, so what is it? So how do you do that? Well, that's belonging in the address. That's going to be tied to the freeing of speech, the removal of certification restriction. To put in cybernetic terms, it's a combination of craffling and cybernetics and systems. Like let me put it this way. The system also has to be negentropic, meaning that you have to be able to do basically the least of all possible actions that uses less energy, less possibility than the amount of possibility it creates. Like what Paul Kraffel points out is that if I just draw a line on a hill, then over time, the erosion will not be as bad if I did nothing. And then if I wanted to clean up the erosion, I'll need heavy equipment and it will take a lot of energy to fix it. So by using a small amount of energy, I was actually able to create a whole lot of possibility without so much energy, which makes it practically negantropic, even if ultimately technically it is not. But that's a complicated system. We make a massive mistake to treat the second law of thermodynamics as absolute. It's more like a constraint. It's not so absolute. Now that's a massive thing I just said. But the point is this: there are ways to engage in very small action that uses very little activity, that doesn't force anyone to do anything, that then with time gives rise to outcomes that increase possibility, that otherwise to realize those possibilities would have taken top-down action or vast energy use or vast coordination that would undercut the outcome, and thus it wouldn't give rise to anything at all, right? But another funny thing is often the small actions are the ones we don't do because they're small actions, and thus we think they're meaningless, right? That they're not going to make a difference. So in a weird way, and I know I'm saying a lot here, but it's an excellent question because you have to frame the qualities of the address.
Right.
In an odd way, you and I choosing to have a conversation is much more difficult for, say, someone to stop than if you and I were to try to pass a law. Like, it's really easy to stop someone from passing a law, really hard to stop two people from having a conversation. But the reason why perhaps no one takes note of us having a conversation is because it seems irrelevant, right? So in a funny way, irrelevant things are invincible, why things that matter are very weak, right? So things that actually, quote unquote, don't matter are actually much harder. Like, also, it's way harder for a government to stop two people from talking than it is to stop people from passing a law, right? So the new address would like to suggest that if you have an accumulation of people doing small things that don't seem like it matters, that the accumulative result will actually begin modeling something that can spread, that will then give permission and even give them the idea to do something that if more and more people did, thus increasing the probability structure that the average person does it, as a burger or whatever would say, that as you do that, it brings about a qualitative change in the average person to actually then be able to handle value diversity. And that's where the social coordination mechanism is a big deal, because if people go online and see a bunch of people having 3-hour philosophy conversations about ideas when they're not being paid for it, then they go, maybe that's not a waste of time to do, and maybe it's okay if I want to do that. And then if actually having these kind of conversations changes the way you experience reality to make you able to handle value diversity, and you've modeled to people doing that, and thus also given them permission for them to do it, then if they start doing it, the people who see them and their circles changing start having a spread. And if this kind of use of language actually goes a long way to being able to handle complexity, well, now you're starting to talk about a cultural change. And this combination of YouTube, Zoom, posting videos is a architecture to create a space that shows people how to do that so they form new habits of using language. And then if you remove things like this, these are other subjects, if you remove the practical college monopoly on credentials, you make it easier to start businesses, you allow rich people to give money to anyone they want, even if they're not a nonprofit organization, because that has massively restricted the flow of money. You do things in the system that make flow easier. Negations, not additions, negations. You increase flow in the system. And this is when you do start looking at the legislative. But the issue is you're looking at the legislative not to top-down force people to do things, but to remove barriers keeping people from doing things. And that's very different. But the culture has to come first. The culture has to come first. So you have the culture change. You have the barriers removed so that people can flow. And then you have the education system be about oral education, not trivia and tests. So an educated person is one who's actually able to think through and unfold ideas, because you're not going to be able to have value diversity in competition if people can't unfold ideas, right? So you transform the paradigm of what it means to be educated from getting a job, getting certified, because you remove the certification system, which we no longer need because you now have a portfolio online. We have this system. Like resumes are a lower resolution of a portfolio. Like you don't ask a photographer for their resume, you ask for their freaking folio, right? It's just that for most of history, we couldn't get a portfolio for most jobs, just the arts. Well, now with AI and the YouTube and all that, we can get a portfolio for most jobs. So you start removing the resume. Well, if you can get a portfolio, you don't need the certification regime the same much, because you can just show people your freaking portfolio, so they can hire you or not, right? And so like these transformations that increase fluency and flow are how you start having an address that is able to deal with the inadequacies of the system without it being top down, right? And we have to go step by step by step. There's a lot more to be said, but this is starting to sort of paint where you deal with the problem of scale with the address of spread. And the question is, what are you spreading? It has to be negations. It has to be a realization of something latent in all possible local knowledge situations. And it has to be something that isn't added to people, but something that is realizable by people in all possible circumstances. And it has to be in a means that increases probability without guarantee. But I think those things are possible.
That's beautiful. Um, it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating the how you laid out the kind of parameters of this, and it's making me excited to read, to get to blowing again too, and to dive into what this address looks like. I think that could be multiple future conversations just
Yes.
on this exact
Okay.
thing. So I
Okay.
think this is a good place to wrap it up. And I'm yeah, it's really inspiring actually, just hearing this kind of the outline of what the address looks like, because it does really resonate, like the negation fact, the um you know culture as opposed to top down, all this stuff. Um, I think I've had a sense of that, but it always feels too abstract or too amorphous to really figure out like what is it act like how does that actually work in practice to have a
Yeah.
culture that spreads. That's something I'm very curious about, potentially for another conversation. Um, but yeah, I appreciate this a lot, and it's interesting to think about. It's really interesting to think about like what conditions are possible now that weren't possible even 5 years ago,
Exactly.
for some of these changes to happen. Specifically, I mean, the education one is a really good example because,
Yes.
I didn't go to college. I'm making a good living just, doing stuff online. And it's like I increasingly hear from more and more voices the breakdown of college as the certified, thing, and increasingly the amount of people that go to college and still can't get a job is like that is going way up. And it's like, okay, that's going to create a widespread, like, I think it's already happening. Like what is a better way to do things? And I think but I mean, there's so many other examples of what that could look like, in terms of the conditions right now. In on a kind of selfish practical lens, I'm having the thought of like, what career or what path could look like personally to actually
Oh, yeah.
engage in that sense. One of the potential businesses that I've been considering and speaking to investors. I'm not sure if I want to get investment money for it because that has all sorts of strings, but
Sure.
essentially it's workforce development. It's basically training people into learning how to run quantum computers or AI, or all these different things that didn't exist, which I think speaks to that transition of like the way to actually be workforce ready is not college anymore. But then that begs a question but then what I struggle with is that's still like, I'm going to teach you how to make money by learning, giving you a skill, which I think is good, and I don't think it solves the value. Having a it, it does. I'm very curious about the address of how do you have a exchange of a marketplace of values, like what actions on an individual level actually support the probability and conditions for that to emerge. And but that's a whole conversation we can have. But
Well, you see, the issue is that money is not bad, and I don't like the commodity form does not have to be abolished. There are many kind of communist Marxist thinkers that say that. The problem is that the commodity form becomes the only value people can think. It's not a solution to not teach people how to think in that value form, because the gaining of the commodity form was a real freedom. It allowed people to exchange with one another who otherwise would have never interacted. The Muslim and the Hindu have something in common because they can exchange. It creates a common language of, like, money is a language. You can now communicate with people around the world. Like, money creates a freedom, but it becomes an unfreedom when you're incapable of thinking beyond it. So the name of the game is not, I actually think training people to use AI and quants is a really good idea, because I actually think AI is a massive question. Like, AI is forcing us to confront all this, because if we don't learn how to handle value diversity, and we have one value, exchangeability, AI is going to replace us because it can do that way better. But if we as human beings can create a diversity of values beyond what AI is an expert in, then AI suddenly becomes a tool versus an existential threat. AI is only an existential threat if we're only capable of engaging reality in terms of the one value that it's an expert in. Well, then we're screwed. But humans have the advantage of actually being able to value things according to different value forms. And that, now all of that has to be expanded on, but we're not bound to a single value form. But because we don't like complexity, naturally, we make ourselves bound to a value form because it saves energy and it makes life simpler, right? But AI comes along and says, if you keep giving in to that temptation, I'm going to replace you. So now we have to not be lazy anymore, existentially, basically, and learn how to handle a diversity of value forms. And if we do that, then AI is great, because it becomes an expert in this one value form as we can explore others and deal with others, and we can use it as a tool. So AI basically forces us to engage in value diversity, or it will replace us. But it doesn't have to replace us. It's only going to if we don't have a spread of this address. So teaching people to make money with AI does not necessarily have to set them up, the human race to be replaced by AI. In fact, it would be expected in a world where people have value diversity that they use AI to make money, actually.
mhm.
But they don't use AI in a manner that is accepting that there is no other possibility of valuation. So it's a bothness that has to occur. And actually, I think we need a lot of people who are working with AI who are aware of the need for value diversity, because they're the ones that, as it trains people in using AI, can also be training them in value diversity, in the ability to value things for themselves, right? Like, the very coaches that are helping you learn how to do AI are also making you aware of its limits. The best coaches do that. The best coaches make you an expert in something that they simultaneously make you aware is limited. The worst coaches make you an expert in something and then make you feel like that therefore you have no problems anymore. Now that I've learned how to run this thing, my life is good. Like, a good business coach would say, all right, this is how you have a successful business. This is how you make a lot of money. Oh, and by the way, no matter how much money you have, that's not going to guarantee your marriage works. You're going to have to learn other skills. Oh, no matter how much money you have, that doesn't mean you know how to be a good friend. That's what a good coach does. They teach you how to be very good at something while also making you aware of the limits of that expertise. That's what we need in the AI world. That's what we need in those different fields. And that actually, funny enough, I think a lot of what people have called the meaning crisis actually follows when people become an expert in something and don't realize that doesn't make them an expert in everything else, because then they're set up for failure, or they're set up to think that there's nothing more. Like, is this it? And then they become nihilistic because they reach the top of the top of the crane, the ladder, and there are no more ladders. But if there's value diversity, climbing to the top of one ladder, that doesn't mean there's plenty more ladders to climb. So the adventure doesn't stop. But but you have to be able to handle that revelation. I've enjoyed speaking with you, Ethan. It's been a blast. Thank you, sir.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it a lot.